All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the last session of the day. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers for the last panel here. I'm going to be reading the biographies in alphabetical order, not in the order of presentation. And I am excited to share them with you and hear what they have to say. First off, Sarah Berry is the digital archivist for USU Library Special Collections and Archives. Sarah has a master's degree in public history and has a background in international studies. Sarah oversees the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation Tribal Digital Collection and works closely with Intermountain Intertribal School alumni and partners. Next, Michelle Nicole Boyer is a processing archivist at the University of Arizona Library Special Collections. She has a background in American Indian Studies, which has made her passionate about remediation and repatriation within archives. Her current work at Special Collections focuses on legacy collections, accessibility, and reciprocity. Daniel Davis is a full librarian in the Merrill Kaiser Library at Utah State University and the photograph curator, instruction coordinator in Special Collections. He's been an archivist for nearly 30 years, and his research interests are with 19th century Western photography and teaching with primary sources. Allison McCormack is the original cataloger for Special Collections at the University of Utah's Marriott Library, where she works with a variety of materials, including medieval manuscripts, Western Americana, and contemporary book art objects. Her research and practice centers on what she describes as patron-responsive metadata. Lauren McGuiness is a metadata librarian at Los Alamos National Laboratory, specializing in development and management of metadata frameworks for scientific research. Her work emphasizes leveraging subject matter expertise to create semantic data solutions that enhance data discoverability and usability. Her research focuses on optimizing metadata structures to meet the unique needs of her organization's diverse research community. Mark Offtermatt is a senior librarian and archivist at the Los Alamos National Library's National Security Research Center. He has an undergraduate degree in Russian and Eurasian Studies from the Evergreen State College and an MLIS from the University of Washington. And Hallie Oines is a metadata specialist at the University of Utah Marriott Library Special Collections. She's an emerging professional, recently receiving her MLIS from the University of Maryland in 2023, with a focus in archives and digital curation. Her work focuses on metadata remediation, system interoperability, and inclusive descriptive practices. Thank you, and I'll turn it over, and we'll begin with our lightning talk session.
All right. I'm Sarah Berry. You see my paper shaking. I'm not nervous. I'm cold. Okay.
Oh, we might have to just do the first slide. Where you,
First slide.
and then
Oh,
it should
that's
work.
right. This, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, because I am a digital archivist, my talk will focus on digital heritage, specifically the importance of approaching remediation activities through collaboration with stakeholders and external partners. So when it comes to any of our collections, digital or otherwise, we wonder, is remediation necessary? The way I assess this is by asking these questions. First, in relation to accuracy and context of materials in our digital repositories, do the descriptions preserve cultural context? Are labels accurate? This isn't just the descriptions, but also includes subject headings, terminology, any keywords used in searches. Another big one is whose perspective is represented here? It shouldn't be mine. Who is the intended audience? Another major component to this big question of whether or not to remediate digital materials is our existing partnerships and potential opportunities for collaboration. In short, cultural ownership of these materials should belong to our partners. Tribal nations in particular should have a voice in how their heritage is presented to the public, and they should have open access to their own history. I will now give you a few examples of how these principles have recently been applied to some of our digital collections. First is Topaz. We have a great collection of materials from the Topaz Japanese American internment camp. A selection of digitized materials was put online back in 2015 under a previous name, Topaz Relocation Center. Relocation Center was at one point the official name as assigned by the War Relocation Authority during World War II. But in recent years, this name hasn't been sitting well with a lot of people. There's been a lot of back and forth about the appropriate terminology. We decided last year to change the name of the collection to the name preferred and in use by the Topaz Museum, which is Internment Camp. We changed the graphic, the name of the collection, and some descriptions. However, we did not change everything because it's also important to us to preserve historical record and to make materials discoverable, which occasionally means using period terminology. So I wrote this little disclaimer here and put that on the landing page. I'll read it for you if you can't see it. A note about terminology: relocation center was the official term used by the War Relocation Authority, but they were also known as internment camps. Both terms are euphemisms that do not fully capture the reality of life as a Japanese American resident during World War II. Utah State University prefers to use internment camp in item descriptions, but users will see reference to both terms throughout the digital collection. All right, next up is the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation Tribal Library. If you're not familiar with this digital collection, a few years back, USU agreed to host the Tribal Library's digital collection. It consists of thousands of cultural records like photographs, scrapbooks, correspondence, manuscripts, oral histories. This project has been a huge undertaking of vital importance to the Northwestern Shoshone, not only for preservation, but also to make library materials accessible online to tribal members. I could stand up here all day and talk about this collection, but I don't have time, so we'll move on. In short, for the purposes of this talk, the big takeaways are these core principles that have guided the management of this collection. First, metadata and archival description is a collaborative process. We speak to tribal nation partners directly to consult and approve vocabularies and description of the materials. If they want changes, if it's more appropriate terminology, we will change those. Similarly, we honor all cultural restrictions, not just the ones we like, but all of them. If they don't want something online, we just don't put it up there. Simple as that. And third is building a collection that is curated for a Shoshone audience. This means using Shoshone terminology, names, alternate spellings, creating browsing lists that interest tribal members. So for example, probably can't see that, it's so tiny. There's tiny keywords on the screenshot here. I like to use this one. This photograph was taken at the Bear River Massacre site in Idaho. Instead of using that as the keyword or the location, we use the Shoshone names for the site: Boa Ogoy, Wuda Ogwa, Bia Ogoy. Doing this takes very little effort, but does have an enormous impact. It preserves cultural context, serves a Shoshone audience, and subtly reinforces the tribe and the tribal library's authority over their own historical materials. I couldn't help but add this slide as well. This is a picture of 5 generations of the same family. The oldest woman seated went by multiple names. She had a Shoshone one and an English one. Many Shoshone names did not have standardized spelling, so they appear in records under a variety of spellings in different ways. So in order to make her discoverable, all her known names are written here in the description and in the keywords. Anjichi, Anjichi, and Susan Pertawa. So moving on to our final collection, the Intermountain School Digital Collection. The Intermountain Indian School, also called the Intertribal School, was in operation from the 40s to the 70s in Brigham City, Utah. USU has a lot of school materials and student work, some of which is online in this digital collection. Remediation in this case is not necessarily updating names and terminology, although that is part of it, but the focus has been more on building relationships with the former student and alumni themselves. We are in the process of rehoming school or former student and alumni themselves. We are in the process of, oops, I just said that. This is why I don't use the script. We are doing this for practical and ethical reasons. We're obviously not going to put anything online that's restricted due to FERPA law, but far more important is that the alumni themselves should know that we have this stuff, and they should have a voice in how their experiences at the school are contextualized publicly. We've attended their alumni reunion, talked with many people face to face, and there's been a lot of excitement among the alumni about the collection and being able to see their yearbooks online. We also managed to get additional insight about certain materials, that will help us as we go forward doing descriptive work. In closing, remediation, in my experience, relies on collaboration and building relationships with the communities whose cultural and digital heritage have been entrusted to us. It is an ongoing process, and some of our decisions have not been perfect, but even small bits of progress is still progress. Thank you.
Great. My name is Dan Davis, and I'm the photograph curator at USC Special Collections. I work with Sarah Berry. As a photograph curator, I have struggled with descriptions of Native American images. Part of the challenge is to address outdated, problematic, or harmful language in photo descriptions, but another part is to contextualize Native American images with my limited cultural understanding. A particularly embarrassing episode occurred while I was working with a Native American intern in Special Collections, and we came across this image. Okay, hopefully. Yeah, so if you can you see the description down there? So so it was Shoshone's Squaw. And so it was an embarrassing episode. The description was not in quotes in the inventory, making this seem like it was our description and not a historical caption and or the photographer's description. The incident spurred me to acknowledge my own failings and limitations as an archivist. I had read Zach Jones' article in the Journal of Western Archives, images of the surreal, contrived photographs of Native American Indians in archives, and suggested best practices years before. And I was aware of the need to describe Native American images within a cultural context. I'd also talked with my colleague, Sarah Berry, about her guidelines for describing Shoshone photographs. But it was this episode that convinced me the time had really come for me to do something about our outdated descriptions. Step one was to systematically review all of the images of Native American individuals in special collections, identifying problematic descriptions such as this one. Of the roughly 200,000 individual images described in our finding aids, we have, by my estimate, 1,761 images of Native Americans. Okay, so first the bad stuff. This term is used in 25 different finding aids and 9 photo collections. Even worse, there were at least 8 instances where it was used without quotes, making it seem as if it was our current description rather than a historical description. And even more embarrassing is that it was used in a scope and content note. It's like, ouch. Luckily, though, I did not find other descriptions of photographs using other offensive terms such as buck, savage, witch doctor, etc. I worked with our processing coordinator, and we made changes for the more problematic descriptions, putting those terms in quotes, and we added a harmful language statement. As an aside, I should mention that the review also brought up some other questions about Native American images, such as how do we find Native American individuals identified by name in large studio collections, or even when Native American individuals are not identified as such. I also reviewed images looking for contrived images. So what is, if you haven't read Zach's article, I'd urge you to do that. So he has contrived images, 4 categories: mocked or staged scenes, non-native impersonators as natives, ceremonial objects taken out of context, images that convey Euro-American perceptions of Native Americans or that transmit an ideological or political argument. So in the left image, these are non-natives impersonating a sort of a stage scene that wasn't a real thing. And then on the right image was Jack Hillers, who was the photographer for John Wesley Powell. The story anyways is that these are either Goshoot or Paiute, and they're wearing clothes that John Wesley Powell's wife made, because at the time, most people thought of Plains Indians, and John Wesley Powell was trying to sell photographs at the time, right? So I clearly thought that would be considered a contrived photo. And so the only images I would say were contrived, as Zach defines it, would be these, about 4 or 5 images like this. Okay, so step 2 was to create a 1-page best practices guidelines for describing Native American individuals. And I have to admit, this is a little bit, I have a LibGuide, and it's a little bit of a work in progress. I haven't quite published it yet, but if you want it, you can get in touch with me, and I'd be happy to do that. And so I should mention, as Sarah mentioned, that each tribal nation is the ultimate arbiter over how images of their people, ceremonies, and ceremonial objects are described. We do have connections with the Northwest Band of the Shoshone. A next step is to reach out to different tribal nations and their cultural ambassadors when we do have problematic images or descriptions. I should also mention that the SAA Native American Archival's material protocols are helpful, although they talk a lot about what not to do and not quite as much about how to describe images. Another next step is I need to do more research in the literature to see what I can find out. So the first thing is whether or not it was contrived images. The second was dealing with historical captions. All historical captions are put in quotes. And in fact, we were going to put our description, sort of a neutral description first to make sure that this is our description and not the historical description. Second thing is to describe the people as Native Americans in neutral language, man, woman, child, and then the tribal affiliation, if known or can be deduced with a fair degree of certainty. Again, if an image is of a ceremonial object, we're going to note that in the finding aid, and then we'll reach out to different tribal nations to see what their descriptive terms will be, or maybe even they don't want that up at all. And finally, if we have the name of individual, we would use the tribal nation spelling for that individual. So next steps, continue to do research on creating descriptions of Native American material, develop relationships with cultural ambassadors and stakeholders of different tribal nations, and 3, to expand the scope of review and include, right now I'm just looking at Native American individuals, but there's a lot else, colonialist assumptions, when people say unpeopled plains or vanishing Indians and things like that. Inaccurate terms, Battle of Bear River, of course, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. And even to know there are images of when white people dressed up as Native Americans, historical celebrations and pageants and things like that. So with Native American archival material and when writing Native American history in general, this year's reformer can turn into next year's colonizer. But if only I'm taking small steps towards reparative and more accurate image descriptions of Native Americans, I do take some small solace in the fact that I'm trying to be a better cultural professional. Thank you.
Ooh, pictures. No, we want to see them. So my name is Michelle Boyer. I'm at the University of Arizona Special Collections Library, and I want to talk to you about the Southwest Folklore Collections. They are legacy collections that came to the University of Arizona Special Collections after another institution on campus had to shut down. And when they first brought these collections to us, they had very little description. For example, box 1 would say something like admin files. And those were the things that were put into finding aids at the time. And so people really weren't able to search them. So this started off as a project I was working on to make these collections more accessible. What types of things were in them? Why did people want to see them? However, it really led me down this path of remediation and fixing a lot of content that was there. So the subjects here are mostly folklore specific. They were gathering oral history, stories, jokes, things like that from people in the Southwest community, and they were archiving all of these things. A lot of them were very basic. They used terminology like, death, wedding ceremonies, things like that. And it wasn't until I was really delving into the collection that I saw things like African American experiences, fine. Black community, fine. And then I would turn a page and it would say, slave, bleep, bleep, bleep. And I was like, well, we can't put that in our finding aid, obviously. There were also a lot of folders that said they were jokes. And if you opened them up, they were not funny. They were very derogatory. And they were the things that would really hurt someone today if they saw them and had to read them and thought somebody had collected that about them or their friends. So these were things that I suddenly had to grapple with while going through the collection. And what I found was we needed to make these collections discoverable, but also remove harmful language from them. We had to remove things that were written about gender. For example, the famous S word did show up several times, referring to Indigenous women, which was inappropriate. Also sexuality, there were some jokes that were not very funny. They were very homophobic, but had been collected in a certain time in a certain era. And allegedly, people thought they were funny at the time. So we needed to decide, how do we want to suppress this from our main finding aid while still making this accessible, but also putting content warnings for people that were going to look at these collections. So the first thing I did was I went through every single box, every single folder. Some boxes ended up with 250 folders where everything was written down on the first folder. However, folders would then have content warnings. So for example, they would say, please be advised that when you open this folder, there is harmful homophobic language within this folder. Proceed with caution. Now, those are the types of things that in general on the finding aid, we put content warnings saying, please be aware this material was collected at a certain time, certain space, certain area. So there will be harmful language throughout the collection should you proceed to open the folders. However, we made very, very certain that words, for example, you can see box 205, like says Negro. We redacted that in our finding aid that's shown publicly, and it says African American in brackets. And there is a note there that says a different word was used that we're no longer using. So it took a lot of time to go through all of these different things, but we learned a couple of things. So first of all, if you have legacy finding aids, legacy collections, you really don't know what's in them until you sit down with them. We thought when we started this project with me going through and re-identifying material, it was going to be pretty simple. It led to a lot of questions and a lot of time trying to answer those questions. We also had to find a way, like, how do we remove certain things from our public platform? Like, what things do we not want people to see until they're there with the folder? And also, how do we make harmful language content warnings that are effective and respectful? And of course, we wanted to really encourage the community to use this material. So it was important to put it up, but it was also important for us to be honest and say there is stuff in here that is problematic. We also wanted to seek language from people who maybe knew better than us. For example, there are many Indigenous people who want to use the word Native American, American Indian, tribally specific. We knew, for example, the S word was not going to appear, but we also made sure that there were some other words, like, are these appropriate? How do you feel about this? So we contacted experts to kind of get ideas, and of course, reached out when we could to any members of the community to get more help. And so now I'm really happy to announce that there's 16 total collections that we went through, reprocessed, got all the data from, removed harmful language, removed harmful content, restricted a couple of folders that were deeply personal or troubling that we didn't want people to see without talking to an archivist. And it's really led a lot of people to come look at these collections and ask more questions about them. We've had a couple of graduate and undergraduate researchers and actually fairly recently looking at the collections. They were interested in folklore in general. Didn't even know we had this until recently. But it was a really long process trying to remediate and be careful about the language we were using. So that's just a case study.
Right. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Offtermatt. I am the senior librarian and archivist at Los Alamos National Laboratory with Laura McGuiness, as metadata librarian. And we're going to talk about patron-focused remediation of metadata at the Los Alamos National Labs. So we work for the National Security Research Center. It is the classified library at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and it traces its history back to the original technical library formed by J. Robert Oppenheimer in 1943 as part of the Manhattan Project. Some of our unique paper collections include the radiological cleanup of Eniwetok, as well as the Vela satellite program. The lab also generates extensive amounts of born digital experimental and reference data. And until recently, much of this data was heavily siloed. All right, so in 2023, we established the metadata initiative for the NSRC, National Security Research Center. Our goal was to assess the different methods that digitization laboratories were using to capture their metadata. So still in moving image objects are usually captured at the item level, and of course, paper materials depend on their institutional or scientific importance, but are most commonly captured at the folder level. Relevant metadata was captured in a series of spreadsheets that was maintained by the subject matter expert of that lab, and this led to inconsistencies in descriptions of materials. So I created a series of charts and tables capturing the language utilized by each system and the software into which they captured their metadata. We had a lot of disparities, and we determined that there were also many inadequate or conflicting guidelines on how to use fields. So once we had a full picture, we considered several standards, and we ended up settling on Dublin Core. There were a variety of reasons for this. It meets our needs for citation consistency across our collections. It adequately covers the standardization of our core fields. Probably most importantly, because we have a small team of librarians and a lot of digitization experts that are working with us who don't have any metadata experience. It has a lower learning curve and it's easier to implement than, trying to teach a ton of people, Mark. So as flexible as Dublin Core is, it's still not always possible for us to adhere to those, to their resource types. But it does allow for the creation of custom qualifiers, and in our space, that is very useful to us. So with the adoption of Dublin Core, it was very clear to us that we were going to need to develop a data dictionary to assist staff with the crosswalking of Dublin Core into our collections. And the data dictionary provides a comprehensive list of equivalents taken from the spreadsheets and directs staff towards specific fields within Dublin Core. And that encourages a consistent structure to our citational metadata. It also provides an overview of our requirements, which largely align with NARA, but can be expanded further due to like specific needs that might be intrinsic to our daily operations. And the consistency that we have now established makes it much easier to deposit materials into the National Security Data Solutions database, which is very heavily relied upon by the laboratory's scientific staff and the research library team. And NSDS has several administrative and descriptive fields that adhere to Dublin Core. But the value of NSDS is in the ability to create custom metadata structures that serve multiple user needs. And my colleague Laura will discuss that for a few minutes here in much greater detail for you. Thank you.
All right, so I am a metadata librarian. Up until recently, I almost exclusively worked with the National Security Data Solutions, the NSDS, and just a little bit of background on that. The NSDS was created as a digital repository for LANL, and the idea behind it, not created by librarians, mind you, was that all of the subject matter experts and researchers would catalog all of their own materials. And they got to decide what metadata they chose, and there was no interoperability kind of considered. So I was brought in and I promptly freaked out. But I'll talk a little bit about NSDS and the steps that I have taken to sort of remediate that and push towards interoperability amongst LANL, as well as the broader Department of Energy. So featuring a custom front end and MarkLogic back end, the NSDS offers a customizable user experience for both searching and metadata creation, while equipped with a set of 8 administrative and descriptive metadata fields that adhere to the Dublin Core metadata standard. The true beauty of the NSDS really is the ability to create custom metadata structures that can serve multiple user needs. The flexibility in metadata structures serves a unique purpose at LANL, where large rifts have grown between how LANL researchers search for library resources and how NSRC librarians are cataloging those materials. Researchers are overwhelmingly requesting custom scientific metadata fields, which Mark and I have worked really hard to standardize over the years. But this work is ultimately bridging a gap between the researcher and the librarian, and it's improving access to research data. So this may sound utopian. There are obvious drawbacks, though, to maintaining a lot of custom metadata fields without the use of XML Dublin Core qualifiers. Library staff have been working to standardize a cataloging process, which is what I have up here on the screen, that's currently revolving around a growing set of scientific metadata fields. The goal is to create a metadata structure that meets the needs of the data, the researchers team, and the laboratory at large, which are often kind of at odds with one another, honestly. The growth of the NSDS has really exacerbated long-standing concerns regarding the multitude of ways creators and contributors, are representing the same metadata entities differently. So with that in mind, I developed this workflow for approving the creation of metadata fields coming from the researchers, and then an accompanying process for funneling these fields into an ever-evolving data structure standard. So this means that when researchers are asking to use custom metadata fields, they're doing so by collaborating with library staff. And this is a collaborative method that is maximizing the capture of scientific understanding rather than simply us implementing a standard onto them. Lannel's experience with participation between librarians and subject matter experts has encouraged what in a 2013 paper authors Yarmy and Baker called strategic management of informed consensus and negotiation. And iterative changes that we're making reflect the long-term process of learning. I mentioned earlier I freaked out a little bit, so I went online and I was like, someone must have had this problem. I found this paper and it was really, really, I don't know if heartwarming is the right word, but comforting, I guess. But- So for metadata unique to the Department of Energy, where data structure standards are proprietary to the laboratory or lacking entirely in most cases, this collaboration between subject matter experts and librarians is really priceless. During a preliminary audit of the metadata used within the NSDS, I discovered the use of seemingly very similar metadata elements. Direct interactions between myself and the researchers led to in-depth conversations about the nuances of that community's lexicon. So the product of these conversations led to the development of comprehensive definitions and value standards for a much more streamlined list of terms. At this time, the refined lexicon that we've created allows our scientific community to agree upon a common vocabulary while still maintaining a metadata standard. And while many terms were retained, following the participatory framework of Yarmy and Baker really allowed me to clarify a lot of technical connotations that were maybe really important to the scientific community. So we have come a long ways at the NSRC, but going forward, there's still a lot of work to do. Librarians are going to continue improving on existing metadata structures and content standards for scientific metadata, probably forever. And in the meantime, catalogers will continue implementing existing standards while also identifying gaps that need to be addressed. Future catalogers are going to need to enhance the descriptive metadata in legacy records, and the NSDS will absolutely require bulk updates to technical and administrative metadata fields to move them into compliance with new standards. It's a work in process. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to see so many people here to talk about metadata, my favorite topic. Thanks for sticking it out to the end of the conference. I really appreciate y'all. Hallie and I are excited to share some updates about a project involving women's archival materials at the University of Utah's Marriott Library Special Collections. So the Marriott Library holds a number of archival collections containing materials created by or centering on the experiences of women in the Intermountain West. Some of you may be familiar with the Irene H. Clyde 20th Century Women's Legacy Archive, a well-known artificial or umbrella collection. It aims to preserve the life history of women who represent social and cultural change and come from a variety of different racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. However, this collection, as Hallie mentioned yesterday, does not contain every archive of women's materials in the library. For example, collections and materials from the 19th century or earlier are not part of the Clyde archive. But either way, guaranteeing that collections will be found and used by students, faculty, and other researchers extends beyond including them in an umbrella archive. And a number of our older collections of women's materials, for example, didn't have the words woman or women anywhere in the finding aid at all. So our project responds to a few key issues impacting the accessibility of these archival collections. And the first factor involves the different types of metadata at play here. Our finding aids, which are uploaded to Archives West, contain detailed box and folder listings for most collections, and some are even processed at the item level. This allows patrons to see detailed information about what each collection contains. But when the finding aid records are transformed into MARC-encoded bibliographic records and ingested into our online library catalog, those box and folder listings are not preserved. Instead, we rely on terms from controlled vocabularies like the Library of Congress subject headings and the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus to share top-level information about the topics and document types contained within those archives. Adding these terms to the catalog record requires someone who's been trained in the usage of these vocabularies. They are not what I would call common English parlance by any means, and this process can be very time-consuming. But beyond this structural difference, The communities we serve have some very distinct preferences when it comes to searching for library materials. University students, and to a large extent our faculty as well, want to look only in the library catalog and find everything they have access to. Many of them, especially our undergraduate students, simply will not look in other databases like Archives West, even if we prompt them to do so. No one has that experience. Outside researchers, on the other hand, prefer to use large aggregate portals like OCLC's WorldCat or ArchiveGrid, which allow them to search library collections across the world all at once, so they don't need to know the specifics of any particular archival holdings. But both of those options require the archival records to be translated, as it were, into bibliographic records and uploaded into these different systems. Doing this kind of work for even a small portion of our archive was not possible without additional staffing. After several years of rejections, in 2023, I was awarded an archival projects grant from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, which is a division of the National Archives. There's our logo down there, to remediate records specifically for women's archives. And I initially identified a set of 467 records to remediate, and Hallie was hired to complete the actual enhancements.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to talk tech, which is exactly what you want at the end of the conference. So thank you. Specifically, I'm here to discuss the process I developed for the day-to-day remediation of metadata for the women's collection. My starting point was almost always finding aids created by our special collections archivists. Thank you so much, Claire, and others who are not here. These finding aids range from brief records to in-depth item-level descriptions. Once a collection was identified, I checked its status within OCLC. If it wasn't established yet, I would utilize mark edit to import the bibliographic record using the finding aid XML file. I chose to do all my cataloging in OCLC connection due to tools available within the system and the verification factor. Once a record was created, I would conduct data standardization, ensuring the consistency in required fields such as title, access restriction, content description, etc. If necessary, I would research the material, as there are, I'm sure many people find very similar names in family records. So many Mary Smiths, Joseph Smiths, Brigham Youngs, who are not that Brigham Young. So I would conduct that kind of research to ensure proper naming conventions. Perhaps the most important tool was controlled vocabularies that Allie mentioned. By utilizing controlled vocabularies rather than free-form descriptions, we are able to ensure optimal search conditions for users, allowing fewer alternate search term variants. For subject headings, I included both broad and narrow search terms to ensure increased user discoverability regardless of search parameters. When working with collections of marginalized individuals, I prioritized inclusive reparative descriptive metadata. This included person-centered descriptions with terminology preferred by the community. The final step is to import the new record into Alma, adding a holding and item record if necessary. Now, this is just going to be ugly for anybody who doesn't do cataloging. I apologize. Here is a unprocessed record. It was a batch upload. So if you can see the 245 field, that is a title, and you can see just electronic resources, and it gives you nothing. What we're looking for is a 600. Anything that starts with 600, that is a subject field. You might be able to notice there's nothing. So this record tells us nothing about the collection. So if we were searching for this, it would be very difficult to find. This is the result after I did some remediation work. Everything that's hyperlinked means that it is connected to a, let's see, either a NACO record or a LC controlled record. So that means that if we have down here, what was the example that I used? Zuni art. If there's a manuscript anywhere within our general collections that discusses Zuni art, Zuni is a Native American tribe, that means that not only will the manuscript come up, but this collection will also pop up. So by allowing the controlled vocabulary usage to overlap with our general collection, it means that our users can find our archival collections as well as our manuscripts and published materials at the same time. This does have some drawbacks, however, as you might notice, the term Lakota Indians or Native Americans is not on there. So because we are using national standards, we have less control over these controlled vocabulary terms. This also helps us indicate the formats. So that's going to be in the 655s, and then the 710s are all of the published works. That means that anything that is mentioned down here is searchable now in our database. And now you don't have to look anymore.
So as of last week, Hallie has remediated a total of 608 records for archival collections, and 267 of those were not part of the Clyde archive. The number of creators, that is people or organizations who actually created these documents, per record has increased by 12%. Subject headings which describe the topic represented in the collections have increased by 94%. And genre form headings, which let patrons know exactly what type of documents, like tin types or meeting minutes, are contained in the collections, are up by 133%. These numbers have a direct and measurable impact, not only in how easily patrons will be able to locate archives they may wish to use for coursework and research, but they also allow patrons to make connections between separate archives and with the printed materials held throughout the library. And that's the entire point of the Marriott Library's special collections, to ensure that communities can access these collections and the incredible stories contained within now and for generations to come. If you'd like to contact us after today, you're welcome to send us an email. We're happy to share additional details about this work. Thank you all so much.
All right, and now we're able to take questions. If anyone has questions, please direct them to the people who were presenting so we can get the microphone to the right person on the stage.
A general question for anybody who wants to answer it, except for I think I already know Hallie and Hallie's answer. In the process of working on remediation, did anybody come up with like a takedown policy for stuff that maybe just isn't appropriate to be online that was?
Okay, hello. I hate speaking for USU as a whole, but that is something that we've been working on, is creating a takedown policy. But mindfully, so there's a large committee of people on this committee who have either curators or metadata librarians or those types of specialties, where we're just assessing kind of what the plan would be if we were to get a complaint, or what falls under the category of harmful language or harmful content. And then kind of that process of getting that to the appropriate people within the institution to evaluate whether or not it is justified in taking down. So it is a work in progress, but it is something that we are trying to implement going forward.
So as you were talking about remediation, it made me think about some of the research I've done in German research on Holocaust records. And it was weird because it was like the first time that dawned on me that in German research, so the German terminology that was used during the Nazi era became defunct, and yet you have to know the terminology in order to do the research I know that the National Holocaust Museum, they had printed out a book that talked about the record collections that were found in Arlson archives in Germany. And they had to like delineate and explain everything that was there. And there are like 17 million records in this collection. And so it's interesting to me to finally make like that connection that in US research and with finding aids that we have to do remediation, but at the same time, we have to create summaries that explain that, because when you have newer researchers coming in that may not be aware of these things, because as we move things out and clean things up so that it is less offensive, how do we make sure that people can find that which is offensive that is now deemed offensive? If you get what I'm saying, it's like really complicated, because when I do my German research and I'm looking at something, I know what I'm looking at, and it's not considered offensive, it's considered historic. And I know that sounds a little bit callous, but it's like, how do you maintain the historical aspect and accuracy and authenticity so that it can still be findable while addressing that it needs to be remediated? And how do you create that in the summary so that it's available for future generations to come that may not be aware that we made changes?
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I think it's a balancing act for sure. Trying to address that terminology, but also, like you said, maintain the discoverability of it. Yeah, with Topaz, that's kind of where it came. There were a couple of us that just got together and which ones should we change? Which terms, where is it the most appropriate to change the name? We don't want to wipe it completely clean. It's going to come up in OCR. If anybody's searching, it's going to be there within the documents themselves. So we had decided as a team that we would just limit our changes to titles and anything that comes from us. And like Dan was saying earlier, you know, is it in quotations, or, you know, where is that term coming from? Is it clear that the patron understands that we are not using that term, but we are maintaining its place, I guess, in the historical record?
And I think using controlled vocabularies also offers a lot of benefits in this situation. If you're working in a system that has back-end authority control and you are linking to those authorities, right, as a term changes, it gets automatically updated and that old term is preserved. So you can still search on it, but it isn't what patrons are seeing, right? And so that, again, allows for the use of outdated terms, even if we don't want those to appear in our system. And some systems also have local controls where you can pick like locally displayed terms that are different than like a national standard. So there's a lot of layers that you can do here. But I think it's also an opportunity, especially for archival records, to make good use of those free text fields, like the biographical notes, scope and contents notes. So you can note if, for example, one of the imprisonment camps, for example, has changed names, right? So Topaz, formerly known as whatever. And so that's another way where you can have some of those keywords, but you can also make sure that like there's a narrative that talks about the changes. But yeah, it's definitely a difficult thing to balance, especially if you're working in a more bare bones system where you don't have that authority control aspect.
Claire.
I have a question on your folklore collection that you did where you put your content warning. Did you just put something on the outside of the folder? How did you do that physically?
So physically on the outside of the folder is a note that says, in a lot of different, there's different things, but it'll say content warning. This folder contains, in quotes, jokes that have racially sensitive material or, you know, negative terminology, derogatory terminology. And we know, you know, it was collected by this researcher and this is what's in this folder. And it says, you know, proceed with caution. Be aware it's in there.
I just have a quick question. So, and this can be answered by anyone who's been doing things with authority controls. Have you established a policy of doing your cultural review or like 10 years from now? Like, how are you going to maintain to have sensitive terms going forward instead of just saying, oh, we did cultural review back in 2021, we're good for eternity, you know?
Okay, I'll take this one too. That's a great question. Again, it's kind of case by case. I'll probably speak more to the Shoshone, the Northwestern Shoshone Tribal Library collection. Documentation is key. And because a lot of our controlled vocabularies were established by communication directly with tribal librarians, I had to write it down, you know, and I had student workers that would have to assess it. And so it's all written in our documentation. These are the appropriate terms that we use going forward. If you come across this term, do this. You know, so it's all written down, but that's very specific to that collection. So it wouldn't necessarily be easy for in the future anybody to use that in a cultural review on a large scale. So that is something that I would love to have some answer, some great, wonderful answer for you. But I think that's kind of in that, you know, TBD, work in progress. As we're just doing these types of projects, remediation, it's not perfect. It's kind of reactive in a sense where when there's problems, we fix it, write it down, and hope it doesn't come up again. There are a few terms, you know, in the keywords or in using Library of Congress subject headings, where there's some that are not great and we don't like them. And I've had conversations with tribal librarians. One is chiefs. That's one that comes up a lot, and they don't use that term. The Shoshone don't necessarily use that in the way that I think others do, and so they didn't like it. And so we needed to come up with a different subject heading, and that already exists because we've talked about before, we don't really have full control over those subject headings. So we found some that are more appropriate. So leaders is another one that we've chosen to use. And again, we've documented it. It's in our MARC records. It's in all of our notes where we've listed all the appropriate terminology. And then when that comes up, it's just kind of writing it down. This is what we do, and hope that it continues in the future. I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but yeah, I'd love to have something a little more permanent, but.
Yeah, I think the trick, if you will, to making that feasible for the future is integrating it into like your standard operating procedures of the department. Whereas I feel like in many places, this is a passion project by maybe one or two people in a department or on the floor, and that hasn't really integrated into the way we're thinking about our materials, like administratively or systematically. Again, I don't have a great solution for that, but it should be something we talk about more, right? How do you not keep this tied to one person's work and make it something that it is our collective responsibility to be doing on a regular basis?
I just want to emphasize that this work is ongoing and continuous. So this is not a one-time project. We've gone through every collection once, so we're good. This is forever. Remediation needs to be ongoing. I really honestly hope that somebody 20, 30, 40 years down the line remediates the collections that I'm working on today, because everything's changed. Standards, social cue, everything, language changes. So please, it needs to keep going.
Thank you. So earlier you talked about the Dublin core and customizing qualifiers and a data dictionary, and it sounds almost like with remediation and with your project, this custom qualifiers and a data dictionary. How did you develop that? And I like what was said earlier about 30 years from now saying that we need to remediate and reevaluate our language usage and descriptors. So I'm just kind of wondering, how do you go about doing that for us that are coming into this as we prepare other people down the road for that? How do you develop that? How do you discuss that? And then how would you share that with other organizations so that we can continue to create continuity as well as a standardized format so that we understand where this is coming from?
All right, thank you for that question. So, oh man, the data dictionary, I haven't looked at it in a while. It's out there and I know that, some of our colleagues are making use of it. Basically, we went through, so we had a number of different repositories that were being used. You may need to help like jog my memory here. And I believe that we chose to go with, so, we have the NSRC, but then we also have another like unclassified research library that's on the other side. And so they had a list of formats and we chose, I think, primarily to go with like their list of formats for the time being for some of the databases that we were using. And so we went through some different systems. We basically said, okay, like this is what you're using. This is now what we're going to use. And then we went ahead and we flagged, this is what like Mark says. This is what geez, oh man, like anything that we could come up with basically, so that if somebody came in and they were like, well, I haven't worked with this standard before, but I have worked with this one, so I recognize this, so I understand like how we're trying to crosswalk it. That was kind of the way that we built it out. And so at this point, like, then NSDS came along and I'd like finished all of this work on all these other database systems. And then they decided, well, everything is going to go to NSDS. And I was like, okay, well, everything that we did in the data dictionary is basically like, done or is moving on. And I'll let Laura talk about some of the stuff that went into like crosswalking into NSDS. As far as the custom qualifiers go, that's something that we're actually working on right now. We're actually working with a couple of librarian colleagues of ours from Lawrence Livermore, and we're getting ready to start exploring like how we want to do qualifiers, because that ties into like us creating a namespace so that when we're sharing stuff between laboratories, that metadata arrives and can be validated and is intact. And so that's an ongoing process as far as being able to share that out. Because we're a classified library, because of the unique nature of the work that's being done there, we likely won't be able to, but we will definitely be able to share out our process for how we went about like creating this thing.
I cannot stress enough how unique our situation is. No metadata standards existed, none. So if you're in sort of a similar situation, one thing that I did was I started building a metadata application profile. I literally just did it on Confluence using a table. And from there, like once you're able to start keeping track of metadata fields and definitions and data types in the database, etc., it makes a lot of future work easier. And everything in the metadata application profile, they're essentially qualifiers, right? So I think I got bogged down very early on trying to do everything right with XML wrappers and all, And at some point, I just decided we need something, and that something is a table in Confluence.
Well, we're right about at time, so I think we'll go ahead and call it, but if anyone else has questions, of course, try to grab people before they go catch their planes, email them, and thank you for joining us.